we're excited that Lynn's here. Lynn is an internationally renowned speaker on anxiety in school and home, and so we just wanted to be able to present, some opportunities for folks, and I'll give it to you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah. So, you way back there. Hello. You guys sort of back there. Hello. So we have a small group, so feel free to just throw your hand up and ask me a question. And I live in Concord. I have a practice there. I see families. I work with anxious kids and the parents that cart them to my office. Although I don't see kids alone, really. Part of my practice is that it really is important for me to give the information to parents. I know that a lot of clinicians will take in a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or even a 14-year-old into their office and work on things, and the parents don't really know what's going on. That truly has never made any sense to me. The parents need the information. Why would I give all of this information about how to deal with anxiety and depression and give it to an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old and then send that kid back into the house and say, like, all right, you're in charge, man, turn the ship around, right? I know it's generational, I know the forces are powerful, but you got it, buddy, right? You're in 3rd grade, you can do it. I really take a systems approach. The other thing to know about anxiety is that it really is generational and it really is social. Anxiety and depression are very social, and one of the things that we found out during the pandemic is that what we do as human beings, and whether we're together or apart, and what's going on in the world actually has an impact on us. So it's important for us to sort of recognize that, and just recognize also how common it is for people to go through these struggles and how important it is for us to be able to talk about them. Also, just so you know, I'm a mom too, so this is my 32nd year doing this job. I have a 23-year-old, he'll be 24 in about a month. He was in senior year in college, March 2020, senior year in college, working on his physics thesis in a lab, and 2 days go home. So he came home and had to finish his thesis in his bedroom. He's actually graduating in July. They're having a graduation for them in July. He hasn't been back to campus. He hasn't seen a lot of his friends. And then my other son was a sophomore in college. That sort of worked out okay. He was at UNH and he's graduating in whatever the 21st of May is. So both of them, I wrote my last tuition check. And my last rent, he used to say, oh, I live in an apartment. I have an apartment in Durham. And I would say, no, I have an apartment in Durham. I have an apartment in Durham. And then my husband is back here around. I don't generally show a lot of slides that have a bunch of words on them, but there are a few slides I want you to see that have some words on them because I tend to be optimistic. The language that we're hearing right now about kids and mental health is really dismal, right? We're hearing crisis and it's overwhelming and what's wrong, and there was just an article that came out in the Atlantic I think yesterday about parenting and what's going on and depression, and it really is pretty overwhelming. I will tell you, because I talk to kids all the time, they are hearing this language, they are absorbing it, and they are believing it. And so we really need to pay attention to how we're talking to them about them, because they're kind of soaking this up. And the more we tell them that they're in a crisis, the more we tell them, and I'll talk much more about this as I go, the more we tell them that this is permanent, the more that we tell them they're damaged, the more that we focus on everything that they've lost, the more they believe us. And one of the things I say to adults when we say, like, they missed out on so much and it was the best time of their life, and did anybody think the prom was the best night of their life? Did anybody think that? I mean, they think that now, but there's a lot more for them to come, and they need to hear that. So 2020, prior to the pandemic, the statistics for anxiety and depression were not so great anyway. Things were still sort of moving in an upward direction. The pandemic hit, and we started getting data early on. And it was interesting what it showed, because in the first few months of the pandemic, kids were sort of like, all right, this isn't so bad. And in fact, teenagers were saying, I'm sleeping more, I'm spending more time with my family, I'm hanging out with my siblings, And I'm not using social media as much because they didn't have anything to post, so it was less interesting. Then as time went on, remember way back when we were like, yeah, we could do this for a few months, and then like month 20, that's, in the second year when they started looking at things, that's when kids really started talking about loneliness and isolation. That's when we started seeing that about the 13 to 24-year-olds were the group that were really being hit the hardest, and one of the reasons why was because they're supposed to be doing things socially. And I don't just mean like socially in the modern sense, but they are biologically mandated to be together. Middle schoolers are supposed to literally like bump into each other and figure out all their stuff, and they couldn't do all that. So they started feeling more lonely and isolated, and also they were missing out on a ton of big milestones. So if you're old like me, right, so okay, I already have a house and a husband and 2 kids and a career, and you know, but if you're 13 to 24, think of all the big things that are supposed to be happening, right? You're supposed to be having your first kiss and your first job and get your driver's license and go from middle school to high school and high school to college, and all that stuff got put on hold, and it really impacted them pretty dramatically. But then, as right, because there were stages of this thing, and what the data showed is that about twice as many kids started talking about feeling anxious and depressed as before the pandemic. The numbers doubled. It doesn't mean that they were clinically anxious and depressed. And in fact, just so you know, less than half of the people in this country that actually have diagnosable anxiety and depression ever get treatment. Best state in the country in terms of the percentage of people that actually get help with mental health, guess which state it is? Vermont. Vermont's the best state in the country, but guess what the percentage is? So they're the best, but what's the percentage? 57%. 57% of people in this state get treatment. And they're the best. So we're not doing so great just in general getting help. And now that the need is going up so much, people are really thinking, you know, I can't find help. You guys have probably heard the BetterHelp. What's the other one that's advertised all the time? Microfilm. But the tele mental health stuff. That stuff was being piloted before the pandemic. And there were some really great programs that were being piloted in schools, particularly in rural schools, where kids couldn't get access to mental health care because of accessibility issues. So they couldn't get out of school. There wasn't a parent that could bring them to their appointment, finances and all that kind of stuff. So they were setting up things in school so that kids could have appointments with therapists who were, you know, contracted and from all over the country. And the results of that were good. And in fact, since the pandemic, there have been some pretty big studies looking at whether or not teletherapy is a good thing. And what they have found in all of these studies, the answer is yes. And it's not based on what the therapist thinks, because we're sick of sitting in front of screens, but people receiving it are finding it adequate, particularly for anxiety and depression. All of these studies have focused on adults. For those of you, if any of you are in a profession where you were dealing with little kids on screens during the pandemic, that's a whole different bag of kittens, right? I mean, like, where'd you go? Hey, I mean, that was hard. But in terms of delivering service through these telehealth services, pretty good. So you'll see, I think we'll see that continuing. So then came the end of the pandemic, as we're all still getting COVID, but you know, lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. So now they're gathering data based on what's happening at the end. And here's what they're finding. So the 2021, so the Child Mind Institute is actually a nonprofit based in Manhattan that began in 2009, 2010. They do a lot of good work. So if you are interested in finding out about mental health stuff, they have programs, they have a lot of good things. So check out Child Mind Institute. They actually just got a $25 million grant from Bezos' wife, ex-wife. I'm sure she would rather me say her name, but I can't remember. What is it, Mackenzie something. So they just got a $25 million grant. But they do a study every year where they look at the state of mental health, the state of behavioral health in kids. And this is what they found, which is pretty good, because a year ago, kids were feeling like we can't even plan our future. That was one of the things that kids were saying. We don't know how to plan our future. We don't know what we're supposed to do next because everything was on hold. this is what, and the italics in that are mine, is that we really want to be talking to kids about the mental health immune system. Kids are resilient. It doesn't mean, when I say that, it doesn't mean that we ignore what's going on with them, but they're resilient. And the key really for me is what are the skills that we want to teach them in order to bolster their emotional management and bolster their mental health resilience. One of the things that drives me nuts, there's a lot of things that drive me nuts, but 32 years I've earned my nuts. The thing that drives me nuts is that when there's not skill building, that when we don't really concretely look at what do kids need in order to manage what life throws at them, in order to manage relationships, and in order to manage what's going on inside of them. Because this is a powerful brain we have, and this prefrontal cortex is capable of creating all sorts of stuff because we have the capacity to imagine things that haven't happened yet and to ruminate about things that already have. So when we're thinking about where we go from here, we really want to pay attention to the skills that kids need, and we really want to think preventatively. So one of the things that was hard for me, necessary but hard for me, is that during the pandemic, I really couldn't talk about prevention very much. Because if your house is on fire, you don't, the fire truck doesn't arrive and then talk to you about like replacing the batteries in your smoke detector. You got to put out the fire. So I was really talking about crisis management and what do we need to pay attention with kids and how do we keep them, okay. And how do we deal with all of this uncertainty? But I can start talking about prevention again now. And the thing about prevention with both anxiety and depression is that prevention is the same stuff that I do in my office. So treatment and prevention are virtually indistinguishable. Same skills. And when I'm working with a child, when I'm working with a family, I'm always thinking, what are the resources that I can pull, right? Where are the strengths? And then where is the gap? Where is the deficit? What are the skills I need to teach? If we look at anxiety as in the most broad way possible, if we look at it as, and I'll give you some other definitions, but if we look at it as what David Barlow calls, probably still alive, he was head of Boston University Center for Anxiety Disorder, he's retired now, but an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of our resources to deal with it. So when we look at that state of that mismatch, worry is actually the cognitive process that happens up here in your prefrontal cortex. So worry is the thinking, the imagining, the zipping into the future, the time traveling that we can do with our brains. Anxiety technically means the physical symptoms that are created in our bodies when our fight or flight system is activated, not because of real danger. That's a fear response, but because of a perception of danger, an overestimation of the problem, and an underestimation of the resources to deal with it. So when we look at anxiety, anxiety says, and I like to pull it out, I call it a cult leader. If you've heard me talk before, I call it a cult leader. The cult leader says, in order for me to move forward, in order for me not to be triggered, in order for me to not feel all of the discomfort that I'm going to feel, I need certainty and I need comfort. I need to know exactly what's going to happen. In order for me to step into this uncertain world, I need the people, for kids, I need the people around me to create certainty. That has become a problem. Because with the goal of creating certainty, we miss out on the developing of skills that are really important for kids, including the ability to tolerate uncertainty, independent problem solving, autonomy, the ability to have a sense of independence and mastery. They've been studying the literal length that parents let their kids venture from them for the last few decades, and it just keeps coming in. It's like, those leashes, those retractable dog leashes, that's how our society has been with kids. So we want to think about how do we make sure that we're not doing what the disorder wants. And I call that doing the disorder. So regardless of the category, regardless of the diagnostic category, because my field loves to give all different names to diagnoses, regardless of that, we want to make sure that we're equipping kids with the ability to handle what the world throws at them. They have had 2 years of the most extreme exposure experiment that we could have come up with, right? We're gonna release this pandemic. We're gonna make their lives completely unpredictable. They're not gonna know what's gonna happen. School, et cetera, et cetera. We force them into that. And so it's not a surprise that they're needing to recover from that it's difficult. But if the main goal is certainty and comfort, then you're working for the cult leader, and we know that the more that you support avoidance in the absence of skill building, the stronger this thing gets. That's just the way it works. So let me go through, and if you've seen me before, I've done this before because I do this all the time, but this is how this thing works. This is the information that kids need. I feel like it's just so important for us to be able to talk about this realistically. I was in front of a group of high school students last week, 2 weeks ago, I talk about what they can do to manage their mental health. I talk about depression and anxiety. Inevitably, somebody gets mad at me, so that's what happened. And a young woman came down and told me that I was invalidating. And she began to say, and I said to her, what did I say that was invalidating? And she told me, and I said, I didn't say that. And then she said, well, you said this. And I go, well, actually, I didn't say that either. And so it went. But the thing that was making her so angry was that she had heard a lot of misinformation. I wasn't blaming her. And she was angry that I didn't agree with the misinformation that she had internalized. So we really have to make sure that they have proper information. So this is how this thing works for everybody all the time. This is how it works. So you've got some sort of anxious event. It can be happening in the moment. So if you're afraid of speaking in public and they say, now's your turn to speak in public, or if you're afraid of spiders and you look and there's a spider on the ceiling, or if you're afraid of getting on an airplane and you've got to get on an airplane and they're calling you to get on the airplane, it can be happening right in the moment. But usually the way this thing becomes a disorder, the way this thing takes over, is when you anticipate it, you think about it, you create this movie in your prefrontal cortex about how it's going to go. And so you put yourself into this situation in which your worry is creating this story. And what happens as you do that, as you imagine, you send a danger message, an uh-oh message to your amygdala, which is a small structure in your midbrain, size and shape of an almond. The amygdala does not have the ability to differentiate between real danger, here comes the grizzly bear, and imagined danger, oh no, what if when I'm giving my presentation I forget what I was going to say and everybody laughs at me? For your amygdala, everything is life-threatening. Everything is life or death. And the amygdala doesn't have an off switch. So when the amygdala gets triggered, it's got one response and one response only, my girl's in trouble, right? This is life or death. It doesn't say, oh please, you've got a 98 in chemistry. Why are you freaking out about your chemistry quiz? It doesn't say there's no such thing as vampires. It doesn't say that. It says my girl's in trouble. And then it sends a message down to your adrenal glands, which now pump you full, little spray bottles, full of adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Same thing, just different words used in different parts of the world. These chemicals now, these activators and deactivators are now going to get your body ready because here comes the danger. Here comes the life or death situation. Here comes the grizzly bear, here comes the lion. So first thing we want to have happen is we want blood and oxygen pumping into these big running away muscles, fight or flight. So we're going to increase your heart rate, increase your breathing. We're going to dilate your pupils so that you can scan the environment, see where the bear is. We're going to throw a little extra blood clotting into your system. In case the grizzly bear rips your arm off, maybe you won't bleed out. All of that happens immediately. It is not consciously mediated at all. The other thing that happens is your body very wisely says, your brain and your body say, we are going to shut down anything that's not necessary for your survival right now. So these are not necessary. Our primitive brain has decided. Nobody has ever run away from a bear on their fingertips. Much more interested in gross motor than in fine motor. So we're going to pull the blood from your digits so that it can be used in your bigger muscles. So your fingers and your toes and off in your face start to feel tingly and numb. Your digestive system is a non-essential system. So when this is getting activated, your body says, not going to digest that fruit salad I just ate, cease operations, send the energy elsewhere. When your digestive system stops, you feel nauseous. So when things are not moving as they should, and when that gets interrupted, it wreaks havoc with your digestive system. So all of these things happen at once. Your heart is pounding, and for some people it's more noticeable than others. Some people are really gut people. The muscles also get really tight and contracted, tension headaches. I had one little boy who came to see me, and when he first came to see me, he was wearing like these little Harry Potter glasses. And then we worked on his worry. He was worried about school, blah, blah, blah. He's probably like in 4th grade. Then he's going into middle school a few years later, and his mom said, you know, his worry has sort of shown up again. Can we come in for a little booster shot? Sure. So he comes back in, and he's not wearing his little glasses. And I remember, because they were so cute when he came in, he has a little, and I go, hey, are you wearing contacts now? You're not wearing your glasses. And the mom goes, no, interesting, we went to the eye doctor after his worry calmed down, and his vision is back to normal. He was so worried, he was so tight. So it has such an impact on our body. And what happens is, if these physical responses are happening to you, say you don't know what this is, and a lot of people don't, people end up in the emergency room all the time because they're having stress-related, anxiety-related, panic-related symptoms. Because your heart is pounding and you feel out of control. The other thing that happens is when your amygdala is in charge, your prefrontal cortex zizzes out a little bit. So you're not thinking clearly. That's why when you're nervous to take a test, you look at the first question and you read it and you're like, this is not even in English. Because your brain is just discombobulated. So you don't know what's happening, so you start feeling this and you start thinking, oh no, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me? Your poor little amygdala says, yikes, it's worse than I thought, quick, juice her up some more, right, and off you go. But even if you do know it is, so somebody can, says to you, well, look, this is how anxiety works, and they explain this, still when you get those symptoms, it doesn't feel good, you still don't want to feel that, you've got to give a presentation, you've got to get on a plane, you start worrying about feeling anxious, you start getting anxious about the anxiety, so you start feeling the symptoms, and then you start saying, oh no, same thing, and the response is the same. And this is how we get caught in that trap. The problem is this, a lot of what we do, because, one, it works, and it's nice, and we want to be supportive and caring and helpful, a lot of what we do is to try and stop things up in the blue area. And it's not possible. It's not possible to eliminate anxious events. It's not possible to eliminate worry because we have a prefrontal cortex. It's not possible to remove your amygdala. Some people have had that done for a variety of reasons. Life without your amygdala is challenging. When you need your amygdala, you really want your amygdala to be operational. We're not going to get rid of the physical responses because they happen so quickly. So even, you all know this, right? You have to have if it's not even something that's, life-threatening, and you know it's not life-threatening, but you have to have an uncomfortable conversation with somebody, you get pulled over by a cop for speeding, right? You get those symptoms. We're not going to get rid of the physical symptoms, but where we can start to pay attention is that green rectangle. How do we give kids the information? How do we have the information so we can say, of course. Can't do my job without the 2 words, of course. Of course you feel this way. Of course. One of the things that happened in the mental health field just last month, which was pretty controversial, is that they're going to put into the DSM a new diagnosis called prolonged grief. I don't know if any of you have heard that. And so what they are saying is that if you are grieving for a period of time, and I've heard both 6 months and a year is what they're going to get, like that's an okay period of time to grieve. But if it goes longer than that, then you're going to get a psychiatric diagnosis. That doesn't make sense to anybody who's experienced grief. You talk to anybody who's lost a child, who's lost a partner, who's lost their best friend, and it doesn't just end at a year. And if you are still grieving 3 years later, that's not abnormal. But this is what my field does. It takes things, and they do it a lot because they want people to get paid, and insurance companies require that we give you a diagnosis code. But we need to be able to talk to kids about things that are a normal part of being a human being instead of pathologizing them in a way that then become sort of who they are. So, the thing about anxiety, right, we want to get rid of it. Nobody ever comes to see me and says, well, what I really want to do is just like change my relationship with my worry. They don't say that. They're like, I want to feel better. I want to get rid of this. Make it stop. But the more you try and get rid of it, the stronger it gets. That's the way this thing works, because we can't stop thinking about something by telling ourselves to not think about it. If I say to you, don't think about your left ear right now, right? I mean, you can try, you go, "Ooh, no," but it's got to come up before you cancel it. So when we say don't worry, when we say don't think that, when we try and get rid of it, it makes it stronger. So we want to pay attention to anything that we do. That's what I refer to as an elimination strategy. And an elimination strategy is anything that we do that has the message, either directly or implied, that if you do this thing, you won't worry anymore. That backfires. And elimination strategies include things like distraction. It includes things like breathing. If we teach breathing in a way that says, this will get rid of your worry. If you have a kid with obsessive compulsive disorder and you teach them breathing exercises, that's not going to get rid of their obsessive compulsive disorder. If we do things like give them stress balls, and we tell them that the stress ball will help them get rid of their worry. If we do things like, let's write all your worry down and put it in a box and bury it in the backyard so that worry doesn't show up anymore. Even if, because I'm a big fan of externalizing the worry, I like to pull it out, give it a name. We're going to talk to it. Even if we teach kids to talk back to their worry and tell it to go away forever, all of those things sound good in the moment, but the problem is that worry comes back. Why? Because it is predictable, it is persistent, and it is redundant. So when it comes back, which it will, because we have a prefrontal cortex, then they say, well, that didn't work. I tried it and it didn't work. So either you don't know what you're talking about, Lynn, because you told me that if I do breathing, I won't worry, or my worry is so bad that even what this nice lady told me to do doesn't work for me. So I must be hopeless. We want to change our relationship to the worry rather than try and get rid of it. And in fact, interestingly, the more we allow it, the more we step into it, the more we let it be there, the less powerful it gets. But there is a huge, I don't want to say movement, it's just been around forever, of sort of like, let's teach you how to get rid of your worry. Let's teach you how to get rid of it. It doesn't work. That's the paradoxical nature of it. So what do we want to do? If we're not going to teach them to get rid of it, then what are we going to teach them instead? How are we going to talk to them about their feelings, their thoughts? How are we going to make it okay to have all sorts of different feelings and thoughts? Have any of you been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, so when you went to the Grand Canyon, were you very surprised at how low the walls are around the Grand Canyon? Like, they are shockingly low. If you haven't been to the Grand Canyon, around the Grand Canyon, they're like walls that are like this tall. So you're standing at the Grand Canyon, and a lot of people, including me, as you're standing there, you think, I could just jump. What prevents me from jumping? Right? And then you think, oh my God, why did I think that? Now, if you are somebody who worries about your thoughts, who worries about your work, and who analyzes it, what does that mean? Am I actually thinking about jumping? Is there something wrong with me? Why did I have that thought? It's just a thought. And a lot of warriors have all sorts of weird thoughts. In fact, a lot of human beings have all sorts of weird thoughts. How do we normalize things for kids so that they can handle it without worrying about the worry, without panicking about the anxiety, and without thinking that they're not supposed to think or feel that way? That's where they get caught up in the trap. So let's talk about some of the skills that we want to pay attention to, some of the things that we want to do. I'm just grabbing my water, camera person. The things that we want to teach, and these skills, which I talk about and write about and think about, are good for all people, not just anxious people, not just worried people. They're good for all people. Because we all think, ooh, that looks precarious. Let me put it back here. All right. So emotional management means the ability to recognize what emotions you're having, the ability to put words to them, which is also called emotional literacy. We know that kids that have better emotional literacy, so they have a more nuanced vocabulary, do have better mental health strategies. So Mark Brackett, who wrote a book called Permission to Feel, is very big on talking about emotional literacy. We've got the three big ones, right? I'm sad, I'm mad, I'm glad. But we want kids to be able to talk about how they're feeling in a lot of different ways. So I talk a lot about the difference between disaster and disappointment. Right? Is this a disaster or is this a disappointment? Is this a crisis? Is this an emergency? Or is this a problem that I need to solve? Right? We want them to be nuanced in that. There is a certain age group, and some of you may have one of those at home, one of these at home, where they go big. They go big, right? I mean, it's big. That's just the nature of that young adolescent brain, right? It goes big, and that's okay, but we want to teach them. So let's talk about some of these patterns of emotional management. I'm going to talk about how parents and other adults are so important in this, and then I'll talk a little bit about what goes on in school with anxiety and how we can hopefully begin to shift it a little bit. All right, so let me lay some groundwork here. And this is probably the most different and difficult concept to sort of get your brain around when I'm talking to anxious people, when I'm talking to anybody. What you worry about does not really matter to me that much. That's the content. So the thing that you worry about is not what I'm going to focus on. So some people are worried about throwing up. Some people are worried about getting stung by a bee. Some people are worried about dying. Some people are worried about making a mistake. Some people are worried about getting judged. Some people are worried about getting cancer. Some people, the list goes on. More people worry about throwing up than worry about ladybugs. Although, I was just talking to a mom who, her daughter worries about ladybugs. What? She sees a ladybug, and I said, do you guys remember what we used to say with ladybugs? Did you guys grow up with that? Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home, your house is on fire, your children were burned. Right? I mean, we used to say that to kids. And we got this little 6-year-old who's terrified of ladybugs. I said to mom, can you imagine if there's a ladybug on her arm, and we say, oh, fly away home, your house is on fire, your children were burned. Right? But we didn't even think about it. We used to say it all the time. Yeah. So, if you focus on what you're worried about, if you feel like that's the key to solving the problem, then you start working for the cult leader. Because then you start having to rearrange the world in order to create certainty and comfort. And anxiety loves avoidance. Anxiety loves elimination. If you're afraid of something and you can get rid of it, right, all the better. If you're afraid of elevators, don't go in elevators. If you're afraid of dogs, avoid dogs. And people do a lot of avoidance of the things that they're worried about. And sometimes that's not a problem at all if you're not worried about something that just sort of happens to be a part of normal life. If you hate roller coasters, if you're terrified of roller coasters, your life is going to be fine if you don't go on roller coasters. But what if you're terrified of judgment? What if you're terrified of making a mistake? What if you're terrified of death? What if you're terrified of germs? What if you're terrified of making a mistake? Right? We can't avoid those, but then the worry tries. And then we, as loving, caring adults, try and rearrange the world so that they don't have to experience that. I was giving a talk a few years ago now, everything's a few years ago, in the before times. And Dad came up to me after the talk and he said, so I think we might be sort of stuck in the content. I think we might be focusing too much on what my son is worried about. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, he's really worried about vampires. Okay, and we tell him over and over that there's no such thing as vampires. We reassure him. Content-based reassurance is when you say, it'll be fine, right? We say, nobody's judging you, which is just a lie, because we're all judging each other all the time, because we're social beings. Right? We say nothing's going to happen, you're not going to throw up, we're going to make sure you don't throw up, we're not going to eat meatballs, you're not going to wear your... I have a client who was, the last time she threw up, she was watching the Super Bowl, she had braids in her hair, so she's not going to watch the Super Bowl ever again, and she's not going to put braids in her hair because that was what happened when she threw up, right? So we try and rearrange. We're going to tell you it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. So they tell him it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. There's no such thing as vampires. And he said, and then we do this thing that I think maybe you're not going to like. Okay. And he says, we put garlic around his bed. I said, no, right? So we're working for the cult leader. There's no such thing as vampires. However, still going to put garlic around your bed. And we do it in less dramatic ways too, right? There's no one under the bed. I will look under the bed right now and confirm with you there's no one under the bed. Right? I just am going to check. I know there's nobody under the bed, but just for the sake of certainty. I was talking to a mom, if you listen to the podcast, I just interviewed a mom from New Zealand actually, and her 9-year-old daughter will not go upstairs in their house alone and will not go to bed without somebody in the bedroom with her. And she said she is convinced that there is somebody in the upstairs in her bedroom. She said she really believes it. She really believes it. I said, no, she doesn't. Because she would never go to sleep in her bedroom. If you think of your bedroom, if you were 100% convinced that there was someone hiding in your closet, would you go into your bedroom and go to sleep? Even if somebody said, like, look, there's nobody in the closet, there's no such thing, right? You wouldn't if you were 100% convinced. So I said, she's not convinced. You're playing, this is her worry convincing her, but she knows. But this is an irrational thing. It's irrational. So when we're focusing on the content, we're trying to rearrange the world in order to make the content okay. We're going to put garlic down. We're going to check under the bed. We're going to make sure that everything goes as planned. Remember, it wants certainty and comfort. So we're going to give a lot of warnings. We're going to make sure, oh, she has a difficult time with transitions. Let's make sure that she knows everything ahead of time. Because we don't want her worry to not have certainty and comfort. And what happens is the worry says, thank you so much for your help, and everybody's held hostage by the demands of this thing, and it gets more and more demanding over time. The reason there is a croissant up there is because when we're talking about process, which is how worry works, we need the content to practice. So in other words, if you're afraid of dogs, we need some dogs. If you're afraid of water, we need some water. If you're afraid of people, we need some people. Because we need to practice handling the worry when it shows up, process. So if you are, the reason I have a croissant up there is that if you are into French baking, the extent of my French baking knowledge comes from watching the Great British Baking Show. But they clearly all the time, like they say, like, make this kind of pastry. Make a cold, flaky pastry, make a, I don't know what they're even called, right? And everybody seems to know how to make that pastry. They know the process. They still need the content in order to do the process. They still need flour and sugar and eggs in order to make the pastry that they know the process. You get what I'm saying? So when we get stuck in the content, we also try and figure out why they're worried about that. And we feel like there's some sort of root cause, there's some sort of meaning, there must be some explanation. Why is this little girl afraid of a ladybug? You know, she's never been like attacked by rabid ladybugs. Why are people afraid of throwing up? Well, it's gross, but it doesn't mean that you had any more trauma throwing up than anybody else throwing up. Who likes to throw up? But some people, it's a full-time job. They think about it all the time. So when we get stuck in the content, we veer off the path of actually paying attention to how we're going to respond when worry shows up. Not if worry shows up, when worry shows up. Because we all have things that we feel uncertain and feel uncomfortable about, and it's different for different people. I'm clearly not afraid of public speaking. It's what I do for a living. If you said to me, Lynn, would you rather talk to 100 people or 1,000 people? I'd be like, 1,000, duh, of course. But other people would literally rather die than stand up in front of 12 people. Because you might spit, just like I did. See, I just spit. People are judging. They're like, oh, does she know she just spit? I know, I just saw it. So if we're looking big picture, then we're talking about how worry shows up. So we pull the worry out, we give it a name. We say, okay, so your worry is named Joanne, or your worry is named Pete. My worry is actually named Edith Ethel. It's hyphenated. I don't know why it came to be called Edith Ethel. I think for a while it was Edith, and then it was to Ethel, and then I just put them together. Edith Ethel, I know what she looks like. She is a little bit older than me, but she doesn't take good care of herself. She doesn't color her hair like I do. She has curlers in her hair. She wears a ratty pink terry cloth bathrobe, and she smokes cigarettes. And she shows up generally when I've got too much to do, when I have deadlines, when I feel like there's too much on my plate. And she just stands there and she says, you'll never get it done. You'll never get it done, right? And then she says, why do you do this to yourself? You're the one that makes your schedule. My mom says that too. You'll never get it done. You're gonna screw up. You're gonna drop something. You're gonna miss something. You're gonna think that you're supposed to be in one state and you're gonna be in another state. You're gonna miss it, right? That's what she says. I know she's gonna say it. I don't turn to her and treat her like my life coach. I don't turn to Edith Ethel and say, oh my gosh, that's so helpful. Tell me more. I say, yeah. I know this is what you do. I know. I mean, I've got deadlines to meet. I know, right? I know. But I don't turn to her and I don't analyze it. I don't try and figure out why she shows up. I know why she shows up. It's very obvious. So when we start talking about process, we're talking about Edith Ethel. When we're stuck in the content, this is when we're trying to deal with the thing that makes us anxious, and we're trying to give a lot of information. We go over statistics, we give reassurance, we put garlic around the bed. We do all these things to try and make the worry not so powerful. We avoid. We put accommodations in place. And I'll talk about accommodations later. When we're talking about process, then we focus on how worry operates. When your worry shows up, how are you going to respond to it? Are there times when you should listen to worry when it shows up? Sure. If you're on your way to the airport and you're flying to Canada, and you realize that you didn't put your passport in your bag, and your worry says, or your brain says, do you have your passport? You might want to listen to that. We're not going to get rid of worry. How do we differentiate between what we listen to and what we don't? A lot of what goes on in our brain is noise, but sometimes there's a signal. So when we're talking process, we're focusing on when worry shows up, how do we manage it? Of course it's going to show up. Of course. When you're stepping into something new, when you're stepping into something challenging, when something's important to you, when you want to do a good job, when something is scary, when you do feel overwhelmed, of course it's going to show up. But when we get into these conversations about getting rid of the worry, and when we say to kids, you have anxiety, which means you can't handle this, so we have to make sure that you don't experience any of these uncomfortable feelings because you can't handle them. And that is anxiety's tagline. If anxiety was pulling an airplane over Cape Cod, behind it the banner would say, blah, 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 and you can't handle it. And the blah, blah, blah is the content. That's what happens to be the content. Sometimes there's a very good explanation of why the content is what it is. You got bit by a dog, now you're afraid of dogs. You almost drowned, now you're afraid of water. Sometimes there's no explanation at all. Why is she afraid of ladybugs? Well, they're fairly unpredictable, I guess. Why am I not afraid of speaking in public, but if people talk about broken bones, I actually have a vasovagal response and I pass out? Why does that happen? I don't know. My dad does it, my sister does it. My brother does it. He does it to different things. He's the best fainter of all of us. I talk about this a lot. Right? I don't know. Just happens. You don't have to figure it out, but you have to figure out how to manage it when it shows up. Step one, it's going to show up. And we could use this for any emotion, right? It could be anger. And a lot of times when kids are anxious, it's aggressive. They get angry. We can use it for grief. We can use it for worry. We can use it for impulsivity. When it shows up, then how do you respond? The reason that you guys are all functional human beings, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, you all look like fairly functional human beings. The reason you are is because when an emotion shows up, you know how to manage it. You don't take out a baseball bat and smash somebody's windshield because they cut you off in traffic. When you're little, for those of you, right, if you have little kids, remember their emotional management is terrible. That's why toddlers are so funny. Their emotional management is awful. That's why there are all those great TikTok accounts where there are people filming toddlers about all the things that made them cry during the day. It's funny. She asked for an apple, I gave her an apple, she cried. They're funny. They have no emotional management. That's what we teach them. So the skill of being able to recognize and manage, that's step two. That's what we want to pay attention to. But the more that we help kids avoid, or the more that we pathologize emotional states, the less practice they get in step two. They don't learn. The way you figure something out is you go through it. You get to the other side. So my older son, both my sons are in long-term relationships. And I use the word were. You can tell it's coming. I met my husband when I was 17. He was right? So we're not good with breakups in my family. Very little experience with breakups till 2 weeks ago. And I used to say, my mom would say, like, do you think these relationships are going to last? I go, Mom, either they get married or they're going to break up. I got to be prepared for both. Right? One or the other. And so we're trying to talk about emotional management. Of course he feels sad. But how is he going to learn that you get through a broken heart? Because he's going to get through a broken heart. Right? He's going to get to the other side. You know, the Celtics are helping. We're going to get to the other side. It's funny because my husband is not here. He grew up in a house where there was no discussion of emotions. And in fact, his father, who is now, who died, used to say, and this was very confusing to me, he would say, we shall not discuss that in a Victorian household. I was like, what? Right? It's like 1987. And 1994, and 1998. But we had very few things we could talk about. Very few things. So my husband didn't learn this very well, so he has to get a lot of coaching. So when the younger son gets the broken heart, I say to him, you know, because my son tells me, of course, and I say to him, this is what's going on. And I said, and you need to just like acknowledge it. You just need to say to him like, So he goes, okay, I will. Like day one, I'm like, did you say anything? No. Day two, did you say anything? I go, now he knows you know. Did you say anything? And he goes, oh, it feels uncomfortable. I go, yeah, no shit. Right? Say something. So I hear him downstairs. Now we're like on day 4. I hear him downstairs. We're leaving to go. We have to go to New York for me to do a gig. And I hear him downstairs and he says, hey, buddy, I heard about your situation. Your situation. Yeah, and he did okay, he did okay. But it's just so, like, he wasn't trained in that. Nobody gave him that language. Nobody made it okay for him to talk about. That's what emotional management is. And we want kids to be able to talk about it. We want them to be able to express it. Because it's okay. His heart is broken. It's getting better, but he was sad. He was sad. All right, so let's think about some of the things, the skills we want to teach us. We're giving them this emotional management. These patterns that I talk about, these are the ones that are most prevalent in both anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression hang out a lot together because of this overlapping pattern. And here's some not so great news, but it's good news to have. Untreated anxiety in a kid is one of the top predictors of developing depression by the time you hit adolescence or young adulthood. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A big reason is these overlapping patterns, but also anxiety doesn't care if, as you hit adolescence, if you get your driver's license, if you get a job, if you go to school, if you try out for the play, it just doesn't care. It's all about avoidance and certainty. It's all about, I don't care if I don't do these things. And then as you enter adolescence and you're not doing these things, you begin to realize you're missing these things. And then you've got social media to help you see all the things you're missing. And you have this conflict, and then you get to that place of, well, why bother? I've got anxiety, I'm not going to be able to do these things. So we want to pay attention to how that fast track happens. And it's definitely a track that's interruptible, too. Anxiety is the most treatable thing. In the mental health world, if you got to get something, anxiety is what you want to get. We know how to treat it. People that get good treatment get really, really much better. Kids that get treatment get really, really much better. It's when we ignore it that it gets worse. It's the strep throat of mental health issues, right? It's very treatable if you treat it. If you ignore it, not so great. So flexibility versus rigidity, when we look at anxiety, anxiety is super rigid. Because anxiety, remember, it wants certainty and comfort. Not everybody who's rigid is anxious. Some people are just rigid pains in the neck. But most people who are anxious have a rigidity to them because they're trying to make sure that everything goes as planned. That's the strategy that they've used to make sure that they don't get hit with all this uncomfortable uncertainty. And life is uncertain, so I'm just going to make sure. I was saying to a kid the other day, and I've said this to him before, He just came back after his freshman year in college. So he's really a great kid, very perfectionistic father, very driven, very achievement oriented, you know, and I've said to him, which I say to a lot of kids, it's like your life is walking a tightrope. Right? That's how limited, how constricted it is. One false move, and you're going to plummet. Right? I want you to walk across the Golden Gate Bridge. And I also told him, and I've told him this before, that sometimes he treats his life as if he is always on the bomb squad. And it's always like, red wire, blue wire. Right? I said, neither of the wires are going to blow up the bomb. But you act as if one of the wires is going to blow it up and one of it is not. For all the decisions that he's making. Rigidity, I have to know exactly what's going to happen. And it's very, very common in families to get into this rigid pattern because you're trying to keep the train on the tracks. Now, flexibility doesn't mean that we get rid of expectations and rules, and that we don't have a bedtime routine, and that we don't do things in a certain order, right? It's not that we don't trade in rigidity for chaos. Flexibility means that when things don't go the way that you expected, you handle them. The unexpected thing of the day. What was something that I have, families do this all the time. What was something that happened that was unexpected today, and how did you manage it? But when anxiety is in a family, the family believes that the goal is to make sure. And I see this in schools a lot. So I was listening to this podcast, and so I talk about podcasts a lot. I have a podcast, and I listen to podcasts, and I'm on other people's podcasts. So I was on this podcast, What Fresh Hell it's called. They're two women. They're very funny. But they were talking about their anxious kids. They hadn't listened to what I was going to say. And one of them said, my kid is so anxious, he needs to know exactly what's going to happen. And so we have a whiteboard, and we just make sure everything's written down. And even he bums out, like he needs to know what's for dinner, so I go shopping at the beginning of the week, I plan the menu, and I write it on the whiteboard so he knows exactly what we're going to have. Because if I say that we're having green beans and then he smells broccoli cooking, like freaks him out. So I'm listening to this thinking like, they're not gonna like what I have to say. But this is what happens. And it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because you just want to get through the day. It was easier for her to do all of this planning instead of having her kid freak out. But what's going to happen when he goes off to college? What's going to happen when he has a roommate? What's going to happen when he walks into the cafeteria and he really wanted pepperoni pizza and they're serving crab meat quiche? What's going to happen? Because he's not getting any practice being flexible. And the other thing is that rigidity makes it hard to get along with people because you demand that the rest of the people in your orbit follow your cult leader's rules. This was my father-in-law, right? An anxious guy, but, you know, like, we're not going to discuss that in the Victorian household because any conversation about anything except for animal sightings, the weather, and what was happening on the mountain where they lived, anything other than those three things made him uncomfortable. And then weather had to get taken off the list because that became controversial. Incredibly rigid. Only wore white button-down shirts. Wanted to leave my wedding before we cut the cake because it was his bedtime. So the Irish Catholic father-in-law came up against the Irish Catholic mother. He did not leave the wedding. But it was the rigidity. So when you think about how are you going to inject flexibility, again, it's not chaos. Flexibility exists outside of the times when you can't do the things that make sense. And that's okay. All right, global versus parts. This is another pattern. Global versus parts means a global attributional style, we call it. A global attributional style means that you paint the world with a broad brush. So you use big words like nobody, everything, always. Nothing ever goes my way. I always make mistakes. Nobody likes me. I'll never figure this out. That's the language of being overwhelmed. And when people are global, that is a huge risk factor a huge indicator of both anxiety and depression, because if you paint the world with that broad brush, where does your hope go? Right? Nothing ever goes my way. Nobody understands me. I never get what I want. All of those, right? That's the Eeyore view of life. And so what we want to listen to is we want to listen for that global language, which is around a lot. You hear it all over the place. And you want to start talking about parts. You want to start talking to your kids and to yourself about things that are broken up into parts. This is how we all get big projects done, right? You look at your basement and you think, oh my God. And then you're like, all right, I'm just going to start. You've got a huge project for work. You've got a book to write. You've got a room to paint. You've got a child to raise. Right? Remember when they were in kindergarten and you started worrying about what it was going to be like when you sent them off to college? Right? You've got some time. We're going to take it. We got to get through fourth grade first. And when we break things down into parts and when we teach kids about sequencing, then it makes life more manageable. There's an order to things. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. The other thing we want to talk about with kids in parts is the parts of themselves. So you have a worry part. We pulled it out. We named it Joe. And you also have a friendly part. And you have a part that gets frustrated, but then you also have this part that really figures things out. And we start talking to them all their different parts and all the parts of you. And it just makes them more versatile as they move through their lives and move through relationships. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So when you hear this global stuff, when you hear it show up, that's a time to say, you know what, it sounds like you're overwhelmed. We need to break this down into parts, don't we? What do you think? Can we think about the beginning and the middle and the end? And then you remember that stuff. And then the next time that they freak out, you say, you know what, this is a familiar thing. When your worry shows up, you go global, don't you? When you get your feelings hurt, you go global. My son was lying in bed after the helmet catch of the Giants-Patriots Super Bowl. He's 7 years old. He's lying in bed crying. He's so devastated. This is terrible. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me. And I said, well, okay, so one, that's not true. And also, there's another little boy who's in Long Island, and he can't fall asleep either because he's so excited. He's so happy. So if you're going to be in this fandom, if you're going to be in this place, you got to be able to handle all these different emotions because it's completely out of your control. And then he's like, okay. And he goes, also, I have no friends. I was like, okay, you have a lot of friends. You're going global on me, buddy. Right? You're sad. You're really disappointed. You're having big, strong feelings. But you're going global. So we need to pull it back. There's going to be a part of you that's going to be overjoyed when they win, which that part of him has gotten lots of nice things. He was at the Atlanta Super Bowl when they won. He was there. He spent all his money and he watched that Super Bowl. And you're going to be devastated when they trade him to Tampa. Or when they trade him to Tampa. You're going to be sad, right? So if you're going to be in this world, and this is just, the Patriots are just an example of emotional management. It just happens to be the place where he was hanging out a lot as a kid. That was his world. We break it down. We let them experience all the different parts. So catastrophic, this is a pattern where you go to the worst case scenario. So anxious people go catastrophic. They think about the worst thing. And they believe that that is sometimes protective. So if I think about it, if I plan for it, if I pay attention to it, if I imagine it, then somehow, either because I'm ready for it, or even sometimes superstitiously, that'll prevent it from happening. Catastrophic parenting is when you're experiencing something, or your kids are experiencing something, and you go through the worst case scenario for them. You talk to them about the bad thing that could happen. And you do it because you say, like, I need them to know. But the result of that, because we know what the research says, catastrophic parents create anxious kids, because here's what happens. These kids lose the ability to assess reasonable risk, because they're always taken to the worst case scenario. So if you ride your bike, can you fall off your bike and break your arm? Yes, my son did that. Can you crash? Can you, all the things that can happen to you when you ride a bike? Yes, yes, yes. But if we want kids to assess reasonable risk, if we want them to learn how to make decisions, to recognize that some things are more risky than others, If we always give them the catastrophic outcome, that's what they begin to pay attention to. So if you say to your child, I'm going to leave you home alone for the first time, and here's the deal, right? I don't want you to let anybody in. When you're home alone, you open the door for no one. That is perfectly fine. You want to give them the instructions. They need to know how it works. If then you say to them, and let me tell you why, okay? Because there are people who will steal you. I'll go to the grocery store, I'll come back, you'll be gone, I'll never see you again. Do you understand? That's why you don't open the door. And then they end up in my office, and the mom's like, I can't go anywhere in the house without her knowing where I am. Or she's 15 and she won't stay home alone. Or she's 16 and she still sleeps on a mattress in our bed. Or she's 18 and she won't go to college because she can't stand to be away from me because the world is a dangerous place. So you give the safety instruction, but you don't have to add the scary movie. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is up here making the scary movie, and this is why you're never going to say again, you're not going to say, what's the worst that could happen? We say that all the time to kids that worry. What's the worst that could happen? Right? And worry goes, oh, I got this. I got this. Yeah, this is what kept us up till 2 in the morning. I can go through this very well. I get why we say it. We're trying to say to them, look, we've got a lot more life experience. And so you think this is going to be a horrible tragedy, but getting a bad grade is not the end of the world. Farting in chemistry is not the end of the world. Getting your heart broken is not the end of the world. We want to say to them, you'll get through this. But we don't say that. We say, what's the worst that could happen? And then we stop. Catastrophic thinking is not problem solving. It shuts us down. It scares us. Talking to a person today who has a lot of catastrophic thoughts about her health. And so anytime she gets a little symptom, she's sure that she's got a terminal illness. And she floats around to different ones. Right? She goes, and so if somebody said to her, what's the worst that could happen? I'll die. Right? Not a helpful thing to say. I want her to recognize when her worry shows up, her worry says, let's make worrying about something that's not happening a full-time job. Because you don't have MS, you don't have cancer, you don't have a brain tumor, you don't have this, but you're going to make it a full-time job, you and your worry, and it could be anything. If you're worried about throwing up, people who are worried about throwing up, it's a full-time job. They have to pay attention to everything that happens around them and inside of them. That's catastrophic. It's not problem solving. So you can give your kids a safety instruction, but then we've got to accept the uncertainty, don't we? So when my son left on his bicycle, so he falls down, he's driving his bike to school, falls, breaks his arm. He gets better because he's got the little bones that get better. And then he gets the cast off. What does he want to do the day he gets his cast off? Woohoo! I can ride my bike to school again. Right? A part of me is like, huh? And I have to say, okay, so let's think about this. What did you learn? What are we going to pay attention to? I got to let him go. That's the hard part because we have to step in to the uncertainty. So permanent versus temporary. This is the pattern that you really want to pay attention to, both in your own language, in particular if you've got teens and tweens. Because the language of permanence is really pervasive right now. This is who they are. They have a diagnosis. They are what we say, they are centralizing it as their identity. This is what makes teenagers mad when I say, look, this is not a permanent thing. There might be a genetic push. Do genes have a role to play? Probably. Genes dictate temperament. OCD has a strong genetic push to it. There's no depression gene, there's no anxiety gene. But there's probably a genetic component. But remember, we've got nature versus nurture, and because we're social creatures, the person who gave you their genes is also the person who's raising you. So it's hard to sort that out sometimes. But when we talk to kids and we say, this is who you are, when we talk to them about their feelings, I mean, the thing I want my son to know about his broken heart right now is that this is not a permanent condition. Using the language of permanence, using the language of identity, they're way into the diagnostic language. They have been told that it is a disease, it is a disability, it is a disorder, it is who they are, and that's the exact opposite. Because all of that language actually gets in the way of what helps people heal from things. When we pathologize it, when we say it can't get better, that's what depression does. Depression is about passivity. Depression is about why bother. Depression is about there's nothing that I can do. I have no agency. Anxiety is about, you know what, you can't step into things. You can't handle it. We need to avoid. The more we talk to kids about how permanent these diagnoses, these disorders, these diseases are, the more we're getting in the way of them doing the things we need them to do. It doesn't mean that we minimize it. Because anxiety and depression are real. They're devastating for people. I see the worst of the worst. I know. But it's about what are we going to do, and we have to make sure that we're not using that language with them. And we are. I know we are, because I hear it all the time. This is who you are. Why do we do that? Because we don't want to blame them. So there was a big movement, the mental health awareness, to say we don't want to blame kids. We don't want people to feel badly because of this. This isn't about weakness. This isn't about personal failure. And we went way over to the other side. That we say, this is this thing that you get. This is a disease. This is a chemical imbalance. The chemical imbalance theory has been dead in the water for about 20 years. So what we want to say is all sorts of things contribute to how you feel and how you operate. All sorts of things. And life can be really hard, and you need support, and you need love, and you need encouragement, and you need skills, because this is really, really hard. They actually did some studies, and a few studies have happened over the last few years, and another big one just came out recently, where they were looking at the language that we use in order to decrease stigma in mental health. And that's all, that's what we want to do, right? We want to decrease stigma. It is so great. You talk to young people now, and even older people now, like we listen to Simone Biles talking about her issues, they're being very open with it. That's awesome, because it's so common. None of us have families. Do any of you have families that are free of alcohol, depression, or substance abuse? No, none of you do. Nobody has ever raised their hand. I certainly don't, not even close. So we want to talk about it. But what they found is that when we're talking about mental health, and when we're using the language of biology and medicalization, when we're talking about it in the disease model, it is increasing stigma. It is increasing stigma. What they found is that if you talk about it in terms of what happened to you, in terms of who you are, and in terms of all the things that make you up, that brings people closer. So what we thought would help, well, we're going to say you have a disease, this isn't your fault, pushes people away. But when we say you've got this thing, it's really real, it's called depression, it is a really hard thing to deal with. It is really common in human beings. And it has a lot to do with a lot of different things. We don't know all about it yet, we're still learning about it. But who you are and the relationships you have and the things that you do really, really help. And there are things that you do that make anxiety and depression worse. There are. And there are things that you do that make anxiety and depression better, and we're going to help you figure out the difference. That brings people closer. It also means that you're more likely to go for treatment. People who believe that anxiety and depression, when we talk about it in that biological way, are less likely to seek out treatment. And it makes sense, because you're like, well, just who I am, I guess. So we really just want to pay attention to that language, because it's gone so far the other way. And when I say what I just said to you, when I say that to high school kids, that's when they get angry at me. I keep saying it, but they keep getting pissed. And I say to them, there's a big difference between blame and responsibility. If you're walking down the street and you step in a pothole and you break your ankle, you didn't do that on purpose. Nobody's going to say, like, you stepped in that pothole on purpose and you broke your ankle. So you go and you get a cast, and then maybe you get the cast off and you go to physical therapy, and the physical therapist says, your ankle is weakened. And so here are a bunch of exercises I need you to do, because we want to get your ankle strong again. Because your ankle was broken, we want to get it strong again. Now that becomes your responsibility. And it becomes our responsibility to talk to kids about what they can do in order to strengthen, in order to build resilience, in order to connect, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So we really need to pay attention, because positive expectancy is the thing that we want to promote, the belief that things can change. Positive expectancy is very simply the belief that things can change. And once we take that away, that's when we really get into dangerous waters. If you don't believe that things can change, what will you do? That's where we want to pay attention to. People get better from cancer and from back surgery, and the research on how people catastrophize pain is fascinating. The research on how parents catastrophize the pain of their children, fascinating. What you believe about your pain has a huge impact on what happens with your pain. It's so amazing, right? There is really no separation between this and the rest of this. It's really, really powerful, in a good way too. So when I'm talking to kids, these are just some of the things that I do. When I'm talking to kids and I really want them to think about how flexible and malleable and changeable they are, these are the questions that I ask. Now that it's May, now that it's the end of the school year, you can ask kids, well, what did you not know how to do at the beginning of the school year? Or what was something that really sort of freaked you out about being in 4th grade or being in 10th grade? And then now that we're at the end of the school year, you're like, yeah, I got that. Right? That shows them how malleable they are. When we're talking to older kids, I talk to them about what are things that human beings used to believe, historically, medically, scientifically. What are the crazy things that human beings used to do that now we're like, that is nuts? Because we evolve our thinking, we learn and grow, we change, we're flexible. A success journal is just having kids keep track of how they handled unexpected things when worry showed up. So instead of saying, I'm going to have you write down all your worries, I don't have kids keep worry journals and write down all their worries and put them in a box, and I don't do all that. They know when they come to see me, I'm going to say, give me your successes. And the successes are something happened and I felt worried and I handled it. I went to my horseback riding lesson. I loved riding this little pony. And then that little pony I couldn't ride, so I had to ride a bigger horse, and I was a little scared, but I got on the horse and I did a good job. Right? You handled something unexpected. And they'll tell you about it. I mean, it's fun for them to talk about it. All right, connection. So we want to pay attention to this. Remember, this is anxiety leading to depression, really has a lot to do with disconnection, loneliness and isolation. One of the ways we've done a really good job that has changed an enormous amount in the 30 years that I've been doing this is the way we deal with kids on the spectrum. That we recognize that they have, that if we're looking for the gap, if we're looking for the deficit, they need help learning how the social stuff works, because that's not something that comes naturally to them because of the way their brain is wired. So we've done a really good job of saying, you don't have this skill, so let me teach it to you. When my younger son went to college the first year, he was in North Carolina, he came back up to New Hampshire, but he was in North Carolina, so he'd go down, and he meets his roommate, because he's a guy, and so they didn't, plan their room, right? They just showed up. And it became very clear within, 3 minutes that the roommate was on the spectrum. And we talked about it more, and his roommate was 20 years old. He had gone to a program close to home for his freshman and sophomore year and learned a lot about being at college and worked really hard on his social skills, and now he was starting his junior year at UNC with this learning under his belt. So he starts talking to my husband, and my husband says, where are you from? And he says he was from, I forget, Flat Rock, North Carolina, I forget the town. And my husband says, oh gosh, I don't know where that is. Tell me about that. So Jason, who's on the spectrum, starts talking to my husband about Flat Rock, North Carolina in great detail, because he knows everything about Flat Rock. And he starts talking to him. And then in a few minutes into the conversation, he stopped. I saw him stop. And he said, I've been talking a lot about me for the last few minutes. I should ask you where you're from. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this mom, right, who's dropping her boy off. Right? I see this mom do the mom version of boom, right? Because she has worked so hard to make sure that he has the skills he needs. We need to do that with anxiety too. We need to do that with emotional management. We need to do that with social skills, particularly based on what they've been through in the last 2 years. We need to pay attention to that stuff. Because when kids are disconnected, that's a problem. And you don't have to have a ton of friends. It's really quantity over quality. But we want to make sure that we're talking to kids about positive external connection. Because anxiety and depression are internalizing disorders. That means that you do the bulk of the work inside. So there are things, of course, in the world that cause you to be anxious and cause you to be depressed, cause you to be traumatized. But then you take that and you go inside and you're in here with Edith Ethel. You're in here with your worry, talking about it. We want you to be externally connected, because if we know that anxiety and depression are internalizing disorders, we always want to offer the opposite skill. And we know from research that kids that are externally connected and engaged in meaningful activities, and this goes for adults too, do better emotionally. There was a big research study that was done, I think it was done in the UK, a group of researchers looking at the treatment of depressed adolescents. And what they found was volunteerism was so critical in these kids' recovery. They were saying this shouldn't be some like add-on. This shouldn't be some adjunct thing that we say, oh, we're going to treat your depression and you should, volunteer. It should be a part of what we're doing because it's so powerful. So when we think about how do we externally connect, right? What are the skills that we want to make sure that we teach? Boundaries, right, of course, right? You need to respect boundaries, but you also need to have boundaries. We need to talk to kids about that. We talk about that in terms of physical boundaries, right? You're in my bubble. But how do you know when you're to step in? How do you know when to step back? Awkward empathy is the term that I refer to, of offering empathy even though it feels weird. So the story I told you about my husband, like trying to get up his courage to talk to my son about his broken heart, I was like, you need to practice awkward empathy, because he was like, it's just hard. Yes, I know. Awkward empathy. We need to coach kids that if somebody is having a rough time, that you don't have to know exactly what to say. Adults, we do this all the time too, right? You see somebody and they've had some sort of tragedy and you're like, oh, I don't want to bring it up. Like, I'll make them feel bad. I don't want to remind them that they're, they know, believe me, you're not reminding them. But we avoid it because we feel uncomfortable. We need to give kids that language. How do we say, I know you're having a tough time, or I heard you're having a tough time. I'm sorry about that. How do we give them, we teach them that connection? Because it's so helpful. Even if it feels weird, we want to work on this emotional literacy thing. Relationship repair is something that during the pandemic, particularly if you had like a 4th, 5th, or 6th grader and they were not in school during those budding middle school years and then middle school years, they didn't get a lot of practice. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that there is a lot of kicking kids out of groups, a lot of bonding in negative social ways. So I have one boy that I see, such a sweet kid, 7th grade. He goes to lunch one day, and his table of 12 boys, they have assigned seats at lunch, have voted that he can no longer sit at their table. How mean is that, right? But it happens all the time. So we really want to talk to kids about that. I think, and there's a psychologist named Lisa D'Amour, you may be familiar with her work. She wrote Under Pressure and Untangled. She's got a great podcast called Ask Lisa, and she was talking about this. And she said that it seems that kids really want to bond around something. And during the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of positive things to bond around because they weren't going to games and they weren't hanging out with each other and they weren't having group celebrations. And so they started bonding over negative stuff. And one of the negative things they bonded over was kicking somebody out of the group. And then this tribal bonding. Have you been seeing this? It happens. I mean, it happens. It's been happening, forever and ever. But this is what's, we need to pay attention to this. They didn't get that practice. And they're bringing it into high school. Usually they figure it out in middle school and there's some maturation that happens, but it seems to be delayed. A 2nd grade teacher told me a few weeks ago what she's noticed Because I said, second grade, that's interesting, because they really missed a lot of kindergarten and first grade, so what are you noticing? And she said, they don't really know the rules of the classroom, so she'll be teaching a lesson and they'll just sort of stand up and start walking around, and she'll say, hey, you need to sit down. Oh, I was just gonna put away my sweatshirt. No, I'm talking, but they don't know. She said they don't know how to hold it. When they have to go to the bathroom, they have to go to the bathroom. They haven't learned that skill. And she said they want to eat all the time, because they had access to food all the time. She said is this what you guys are seeing too? She said she had to send a letter home to the parents saying, you know, I know your kids are coming home saying they're starving. We're giving them breakfast. They have a snack. They have lunch. They have another snack. But they just want constant food. Yeah. Interesting. All these things that they missed in terms of how to do stuff. Yeah. So I said this, isolation is a red flag. If you have a teenager who likes to be in their room without you bugging them, that's okay. What you really want to pay attention to is if there is a change, and if you see isolation sort of taking over, and that they're not engaging in social activities with people outside of the house. So if you've got a kid who's really, and the other thing too, I was saying this to a family last night, to a boy in 5th grade who is on his phone all the time. There is no research that says that more screen time is better for you. There is research that says that when you're on a screen, when you're on social media in particular, that if you are engaged in positive connection, that can be okay. But if you are passive while you're on social media, particularly for teenagers, that's a big hit on their mental health. So when you're on social media, you have a Facebook group and you're raising money and blah, blah, blah. I have a friend in Concord that has just been diagnosed with metastatic brain cancer, and so there's a group to help raise money, et cetera, and that makes us feel good. But when you're passively, as many teenagers are, just looking at TikTok videos or looking at everybody else's Snapchat, experiencing rejection in real time, we know that that's impacting their mental health in a negative way. So active versus passive. Yeah. Jean Twenge wrote an article a few years ago. It was in the Atlantic, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation? And I'll just give you the end. Spoiler alert, yes. So that's what she said. But what she said is that there's no, the more you're on screens, the more depressed when we look at it. She said, we can't identify causation. This was a few years ago. They're trying to identify causation, but they can't identify correlation. Yeah. If you haven't read the book, if you like to read, if you haven't read the book Dopamine Nation, it is a really very eye-opening book about our pain and pleasure, the dopamine system, and how we get addicted to stuff. She talks a lot about this process, really helpful. If I were teaching teenagers in if I was teaching like a psychology class to teenagers, I would have them read Dopamine Nation. So interesting. It's by a woman named Ann Lemke, who's a psychiatrist. She also wrote a book previous to this called Drug Dealer MD, which was also rather eye-opening. Yeah, but she's very easy to read. She's got a very accessible style. All right, so let's talk about, I'll talk for a few more minutes, and then if you guys have any questions or things, you can pepper me with questions. I know I'm talk a mile, talk a lot. Yeah, everyone says so. So what you want to pay attention to as parents is you want to look and see if you have kids that tend to be worriers, if you tend to be a worrier, because this thing runs in families. If you're an anxious parent and you don't do anything about it, you're 6 to 7 times more likely to create an anxious child. And that's okay, that's just the way human beings work. But a safety behavior are the things that we put in place, the things that we do to try and decrease symptoms, eliminate them, get rid of them. So a safety behavior might be putting garlic around the bed. A safety behavior might be if your child is worried about throwing up, that they have these over-the-counter medications that you give them, so they're always carrying around their Tums. I've got one young person who's got a worry about throwing up, and she has to chew gum all the time. That's her safety behavior. Seeking reassurance is a safety behavior, so I have to know, I have to know, I have to know. Repeated questions is a safety behavior, so going over that whiteboard I told you about with the menu on it, safety behavior. This is not an all or nothing proposition. You don't just say to your kid, if you've got a little preschooler and you're dropping them off at preschool for their first day of preschool, and they say, Mommy or Daddy, are you going to pick me up after preschool? We don't say, well, life is uncertain, right? We'll see. Maybe I'll show up, maybe I won't, right? Got to teach you how to, right? You give kids information, just like we need information. But the repeated reassurance is what we want to pay attention to, because remember, the worry wants certainty. I'll be here at such and such a time. I mean, I have a gazillion stories I could tell you about all the things that people put in place to try and stay ahead of worry. And some of them are rather dramatic what people put in place. Parental experiential avoidance. So this is a term, this is a research term. So remember I was talking about rigidity and talking about control. So the more controlling, parental control is another risk factor for developing anxiety. So if you have a very controlling parent, risk factor. But some researchers said, well, parental control, that's an awfully broad statement. Let's see if we can sort of ferret this out a little bit. And they discovered, or they wrote about this thing that they termed parental experiential avoidance, which is parents that have a very difficult time with their own distress or their children's distress. It makes them feel very, very uncomfortable. So they step in quickly to try and control the situation because they don't like the way that it feels. And these parents come across as very controlling. I'm sure that you probably have had a few of these parents, right? I have worked with these parents that something happens, their kid gets off the bus, he's upset about something, the child is distressed, and that parent goes flying into the school. And everybody's like, right? I have one mom in particular where the rule is she cannot email the school without sending me the email first. Right?
I love that.
And she took her kids out of one school and put them in another school. I'm like, look, you burned all your bridges over there. I know what they think of her. Because they tell me. I said, so you're in this new school, no emailing. It is so hard for her. And they have this impression of her as just this, like explosive, angry, blah, blah, blah. No, she has an incredibly difficult time when her children are having some distress, and both her children are pretty anxious, and she's pretty anxious too. So you want to pay attention to that, because again, it's just about making room for feelings. It is okay for your kids to feel distress. And we don't abandon them, we don't stiff arm them, we don't tell them to suck it up, buttercup. We say, of course you feel this way. Of course you feel this way. When I was a junior in high school, I was trying out for varsity basketball. I'm little, but I'm scrappy. And so the tryouts were happening right around Thanksgiving. And I had to go and take my driver's license test on the Friday after Thanksgiving. And there was a basketball practice that day. So they had gotten down to like 12 kids. So the team was pretty much set. So we had practice on Friday after Thanksgiving. I told the coach that I couldn't be at practice because I was going to take my driver's license test. She said, okay. I went and took my driver's license test. During the driver's license test, I hit a car in the parking lot, which in the state of Connecticut and probably elsewhere is what's deemed an automatic failure. I was very sad, as you can imagine, right? It was devastating. Everybody to my face in my family was like, oh, that's so sad, Linny. Later find out they're all like, oh my God, that's okay. Went back to practice on Monday for basketball. Coach pulls me into the locker room and says, I've decided I'm only going to carry 11 girls this year. I'm cutting you, and also you missed practice on Friday. And I was like, because I was hitting a car in the parking lot. It was so awful. It was a bad weekend. So my parents had a few choices right then, right? They could have called up the athletic director, my mom did take out the yearbook and be like, she's carried 12 kids on the team for so many years. I'm like, I know, but I think she had another point guard that was better than me. I know who it was Pam Bucknell. And she was just so upset. But we went out for ice cream. And she said, I am so sorry. and they let me drive the car to my friend's house down the street that night, even though I didn't have my driver's license. It was only like a half a mile. But they didn't go flying into the school, right? And like, how dare you, right? Unlike Beth Ann Vine's mother, when she didn't get elected captain. Right? So you want to pay attention to this. How do we let kids feel what they're going to feel? So this is another term. I'm throwing some of these research terms on you, but they're pretty interesting. So this is called negative anxiety response style. And there's a woman named Kate Stroud who does some cool work looking at relationships and emotional management, and she looks at relationships between moms and teenage daughters, which is cool. And negative anxiety response style is how you respond to the anxiety when it shows up. So remember I showed you that slide, step 1, step 2. This is about step 2. When you have an anxious thought or when you have an anxious symptom, if you then beat yourself up, I shouldn't feel this way, what's wrong with me, if you ruminate about it, if you think about it, if you try and figure it out, if you get caught up in the whys, you do worse. This is a sentence from a study that she and her colleagues did in 2015. I love this sentence. It is normal and innocuous experience to feel this way. What we do in step 2 is what makes it a disorder. Panic disorder is not that you had a panic attack. And right now, everything is a panic attack. Right? They love that. Everything's a panic attack. They'll say to me, oh my gosh, I'm having a panic attack right now. I go, no, you're not, look, Jen. Right? It's not a panic attack. But if the way you get panic disorder isn't that you have a panic attack, it's that then you live your life trying to avoid having another panic attack. That's how this thing gets so powerful. All right, so let me talk just for a few minutes about accommodations, because I mentioned it, so I want to make sure that you're clear about what I mean by that. So accommodations, in the anxiety biz, an accommodation is anything that somebody does, it's like a safety behavior, that's designed to eliminate, get rid of, avoid feeling uncertain, feeling uncomfortable. In schools, we have accommodations in place because we want kids to have equal access to learning. I am only talking about accommodations when the primary diagnosis is anxiety, because we need accommodations in school to deal with dyslexia, to deal with cerebral palsy, to deal with kids on the spectrum, to deal with kids that are post-concussive, to deal with kids that have type 1 diabetes, to deal with kids that have peanut allergies, right? We need accommodations, and sometimes we have to start with accommodations for kids that are really anxious because we got to get them in the door. So I'll bargain with the cult leader, because with school refusal, we want them in the building as quickly as possible and for as long as possible. But here's the problem with accommodations, with anxiety, is that they are put in place in the absence of skill building. And when somebody says to me, what are the accommodations that you recommend for anxious kids, it sort of makes my brain cramp. Because my whole goal in treatment is to work on getting rid of the family accommodations. Why? Because the more a family accommodates an anxiety disorder, the more likely it is that I am going to fail at my job. So what happened is, this is my 30-year perspective on this, is that accommodations are really important. I'm going to sneeze. No, I'm not. Accommodations are really important for a lot of things. But when it comes to anxiety disorders, we took the accommodation language that is really necessary for a lot of things over here, and we just plopped it on top of anxiety disorders without checking with the people who are experts in anxiety disorders whether or not that was a good idea. And so what happens is accommodations get put in place, and they become permanent, and they aren't evaluated enough, and there's not skill building. So when I look at a 504 and IEP and I'm looking at what they're doing, if the primary issue that we're dealing with is anxiety, I want to make sure that it is not an avoidant plan. And 99.8% of the time, that's what I see. So it doesn't mean that we don't support kids, of course, and it doesn't mean that we don't start where they are, but how are we going to build the skills? Because again, when somebody says to me, what accommodations will you put in place for an anxious kid? That is like, that's the opposite of what I'm trying to do. So I'm in a ton of schools all the time. I do training with schools and we're talking about this. And I, could give a 12-hour workshop on it, I have. But we have to figure out how we're going to make sure with anxiety we're not just stepping in. And this is where sometimes those parents come in and say, they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do this. The College Board has been trying to crack down on accommodations given to kids to take the SAT and the ACT. And what they've done is they've said, we have to see proof that you have a disability and that the accommodations have been put in place and that they have been used by the school for usually, freshman, sophomore, junior year. So they're trying to stop people from gaming the system because one of the most common accommodations that anxious kids get is extra time. So they're trying to stop people from gaming the system, but what I have seen is now parents just get more creative in now getting their child a disability. And it's not helping anybody. And, if we look at the whole college admissions process, that's a whole other wackadoodle-doo thing that we've done to kids. Good Lord, yeah. So being able to look and say, okay, so how can, instead of having, I don't even call it an accommodation plan, I like to call it a skill building plan. So we've got this kid and they're really struggling, so how can we support them and encourage them, and what are the skills that they need to learn, and how can we help the parents? And I know it's not easy because I am in schools all the time, but we just have to shift our thinking a little bit so that we're making sure that we're not supporting or doing the disorder. And it's different when we're talking about accommodations. It's different with anxiety than it is with a lot of other things. So that's a paradigm shift that I talk about a lot that I want to make. But it's hard, and people push back against it, for sure. But it's important for us to think about it in that way. Because think back to what we've done, again, with kids on the spectrum. So 30 years ago, where were the autistic kids in schools? I know where they were because between undergraduate and graduate school, I worked in the school that they got sent to. And we weren't teaching them anything. We weren't even using the word autistic, interestingly. But look at how far we've come in recognizing that we need to teach skills, right? So helpful. It's a big task for sure. Let me just talk about the basics for a minute, just to remind you all that the basics still count. So sleep is really important. I talk to kids a lot about sleep. Sleep, when you are sleep deprived, very quickly actually, when you're sleep deprived, you get more rigid and your ability to problem solve goes way down very quickly. And the kicker is you don't recognize that you're being more rigid or that your problem solving has gone away. So it's sort of like the people that are not getting enough sleep and they say like, oh no, I only need 5 hours of sleep, I only need 4 hours of sleep. That I akin that to the people who are like, oh no, I'm a better driver when I'm drunk. Right, like when I'm buzzed, I'm just a better driver. No, you're not, right? And you're not better when you're sleep deprived. So we want to talk to kids about that. We really want to let them know that the equivalent of dropping your IQ down several points when you're sleep deprived, and parents need to pay attention to that. There is no reason that a kid should have a smartphone in the bedroom at night. So if your kids are younger and you haven't done that yet, hold that line. If they're older, you can also take it away. Parents are saying to me, well, how do I tell them they can't have their phone in the bedroom? I go, like this. You can't have your phone, but they'll get mad. Yeah. Well, how will they wake up? And I go, well, there's this thing. It's really cool. They invented it a really long time ago. It's called an alarm clock. Amazing. You set it, it makes a noise, you wake up. Right? So phones in bedrooms, not such a great thing. Screens, yeah, I talked about screens. Sunlight. So sunlight in your eyeballs is really helpful. And so now that the weather is warm, even 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight in your eyeballs, don't stare at the sun like an idiot, but even just coming in, the sunlight comes in, it hits your cones are attached to your brain, it resets your circadian rhythms. So for kids that are having difficulty falling asleep during COVID, right, I mean, I've got one of these night owls, he stays up late, sleeps late. Resetting the circadian rhythms are really helpful. They've done studies with people who have been working third shift for like 20 years and their brains still can't figure it out. We want to be awake in the light, we want to be asleep in the dark. So sunlight, if you are somebody who has trouble with sleep, get out and let the sunlight go into your eyeballs. In the morning, 10 to 15 minutes sunlight in your eyeballs, really, really helpful. Exercise, I mean, you know, we've known this for a long time. When we look at exercise versus antidepressants, exercise really is great with no horrible side effects or even no minor side effects and even positive side effects. They have also done some research recently looking at the preventative. We know that exercise really helps depression and anxiety, but now they're looking at it in terms of prevention. They did a big study in Sweden, actually. There is this cross-country ski race that happens every year. Thousands and thousands of people participated. So they had this whole group of people that regularly exercise, that come every year. So they started interviewing them over 20 years. They found that if you participated in that cross-country ski race, which meant that you were probably exercising, you were 62% less likely to develop anxiety during the course of your lifetime, with one exception. The fastest women, the fast women, still anxious, right? But we all saw that coming. And volunteerism, I talked about that. How do we get kids to participate in meaningful things? How do we, kids that are involved in, civic activities, volunteerism in school, doing something meaningful, helping an elderly neighbor, being involved in their church and scouts or something, we know that that helps mental health. It just does. So we know a lot about this. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. It's just a matter of implementing it, and it's a matter of working against the powerful forces that are at play that our kids are exposed to. I talk a lot about how stress is contagious and depression is contagious, joy is contagious too. So one of the great things that you can do, one of the simple, immediate things that you can do for your kids is to make sure that they see you joyful. And if you think back to the adults in your life growing up, was there somebody who you just knew would belly laugh? Was there somebody who you could see was enjoying what they were doing? Somebody who just had a lot of that person in your life that just was, full of life and laughing? That is an enormously powerful gift that we give kids when they see us joyful, when they see us laughing, when they see us connecting. So we have to make sure that we show them that. It lets kids know that amidst all the craziness that's going on, that there is a part of their world where things are going to be okay. And I think we forget about that sometimes. So play, silliness, letting your kids enjoy. If you tend to be rigid, pay attention to your rigidity, and one night just serve ice cream sundaes for dinner, that kind of stuff. During the pandemic, we started off pretty good with that, and I think, it got old, right? Yeah, my brother and a sister-in-law have 2 kids, and they were having like fancy dinners. And then they were like, all right, we're on month 8. We don't want to have any more fancy dinners. It was sort of like Gilligan's Island during lockdown, wasn't it? Like we were all together, we had to like make up fun. Remember on Gilligan's Island, they would have like beauty contests, and it was always going to be Ginger and Mary Ann, like nobody else. They would have all these things, but that's what, so anyway, be playful, be silly, play games, turn off the screens, laugh, etc. All right, so that's it. That's all I have to say. Oh, thank you. Thank you for your smattering of applause. Does anybody have any questions that you want to ask me? Is there anything you want me to explain more, or you want any resources or things that would be helpful? Yeah.
It seems like it could be often a fine line between something being a coping skill and it not becoming an avoidance tactic.
Yeah.
Something that's pleasurable and comfortable to avoid feeling the thing, but you need to use that also when you feel the thing too. So,
No, it is a fine line. right? And so, and again, we don't want to go crazy, like there are things, here's kind of how you want to pay attention to it. Are there things that you do, that you have, that help you continue to move forward? Versus are you using something that's helping you completely avoid? Right, so somebody emailed me a while ago after I gave one of the talks and said, I'm listening to what you were saying about safety behaviors and that kind of stuff, and my child is 7, and clearly it's time the blanket has to go away. And I was like, no, it doesn't, right? I brought my blanket to college, like the blanket doesn't have to go away. I said, if you want to say to your 7-year-old, you can't bring your blanket everywhere you go, right? That you can have the blanket in the house, but you're not going to bring the blanket to the grocery store. That's cool. But we don't have to, what's the harm in having a blanket? We don't want to, say like, oh, you can't do all these things. But we just want to pay attention to the things that we do that, the question you can ask yourself is, does my child need a lot of this thing in order to move forward? Do they need a lot of reassurance? Do we have to make sure that all these steps are taken? Do we have to make sure that everything is as it needs to be in order for them to move forward? And if the answer is that you're sort of moving more over to that camp, then you want to pay attention. But if the answer is like, you know what, there's a lot of things that we do that help us do the things that we want to do, then that's cool too. Yeah. I mean, my brother travels with his pillow. He doesn't like me to say that, but it's true. Yeah, he likes his pillow. Yeah. So you just want to make sure, and you really want to pay attention to rigidity. So when a child is saying like it has to be a certain way or else, that's what you want to pay attention to, and that's where you want to insert that flexibility. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. The other thing too that parents ask me a lot too is, how, like, should I push him into something? Like, should I force him to do something that he doesn't want to do? This is not about stiff-arming kids. It's not about throwing them into the deep end and hoping that they learn how to swim. But it's about constantly keeping in mind, I'm just going to keep teaching the skills that they need to move forward. And the skills that I teach, I say the same thing over and over and over again. It's the ability to pull out your worry, have a look at it, listen to what it says. It says the same thing over and over again. How do we interact with it differently? How do we not put it in charge? And how do I tolerate not knowing? And the biggest mistake that people make is they think that the solution to dealing with anxiety is to make sure that all of the information is there. I talk about rolling around in the mights and maybes of life. It's okay to say, like, I don't know. And you shouldn't track your kids on your phone, because that's telling them, I need to know all the time. I need to know where you are. And I need you to know where I am all the time. Yeah. So it's a fine line. Yeah.
And I'm also wondering about, is there value in helping somebody to, like, I guess, identify triggers, but not, I guess what you're saying also is it's helping them to know that it's identifying them without avoiding them, but it's more like a heads up, like, oh, I know this is a trigger for me. This has happened before. When I experience this, Ethel comes back. Like, is it like, I'm not getting caught in like just
not getting caught in it. I mean, people spend a lot of time, like therapists will spend a lot of time helping somebody identify triggers, and I just, like people generally know what they are. And the interesting thing too is that oftentimes somebody will say, well, I'm trying to figure out what makes my kid worry, and I ask them and they say, I don't know. And that's totally fine with me, because what the trigger is uncertainty. So that happens, like a kid will be nervous to go to school, and everybody will try and figure out, like, what's going on at school? Like, what are the triggers at school? And, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And the more you get into sort of like, what are the triggers, the more you lose that big picture of there's a lot of uncertainty at school. And so the more you talk about identifying triggers, the more that you sort of start to say, like, okay, so that's my trigger. And so, and almost automatically, then I need to avoid it. Even if we say, like, we're identifying the triggers, not so you avoid them, but even that language, like we're identifying trigger, I stay away from the word trigger a lot. Yeah. Research has shown that trigger warnings, by the way, like in the high school and collegiate level, do not work, not helpful, are not effective.
I guess I'm wondering also about the idea, like, could a trigger be connected, like, maybe you answered that, a trigger could be connected to a deep driver. Uncertainty is the deep driver.
Uncertainty is the deep driver.
causing the
Yeah.
uncertainty isn't
Yeah.
it, it's the deep
Yeah,
drivers.
right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. And a lot of times the trigger doesn't even make any sense. And a lot of people try and figure out what the trigger is. They're like, oh, we have to figure out the trigger. And then they assess some sort of meaning to the trigger. And they also jump around. So if you've got somebody that has, what we call generalized anxiety disorder, that just means they're an equal opportunity worrier. Right? The trigger just jumps around, and everybody's like, you're playing whack-a-mole trying to figure out, like, what's this? And if I talk to somebody who's older, they can sort of go through, well, I used to be worried about this, then I worried about this, then I worried about this. And so the driver is, I need to know. Yeah. Yeah. And the content, like you say, the content is there. But when I'm doing therapy with people, however old they are, I am looking for the thing, and it's not hard to find. Usually within like 2 minutes they tell me. Looking for the thing that makes them feel worried, because that's what I need in order to practice. So when we talk about exposure therapy, we want to go toward the thing that makes you nervous. But the thing we want to do is we want to have all this understanding about it. So when you're going toward the thing that makes you nervous, you're having a different response to it. Because a lot of times kids will be taught to do exposure therapy, but they aren't taught to handle the uncertainty, or they don't know about it. So say I was weirdly afraid of pianos, right? So I'm going to go near the piano. So I'm like, I know that the piano is my trigger. So I'm going to go near the piano. Okay, oh gosh, I got to go near the piano. Now as I'm doing that, remember, the amygdala is just waiting for the uh-oh message. The amygdala is getting the uh-oh message. The amygdala doesn't know what a piano is, but it's like, okay, so she's acting as if that's dangerous, and then off you go. So what we want to do, I'm sort of getting into the weeds here, but what you want to do is you want to flip it on its head, so that we want to teach you, like, I'm going to go near the piano, right? I'm going to, oh, I love this piano. Oh, this is such a nice piano. Now my amygdala is saying, okay, so wait a second. You've told me for years that pianos are dangerous, and now you're acting very differently toward the piano. That's what we want to have happen, because the amygdala learns through experience. So when we're going towards something that is scary to us, we want to offer the amygdala a different story, even if we're faking it at first. So that's why, a trigger is helpful to know, just because that's where I'm going to practice. So for me, broken bones, right? So I've got to step into broken bones, which happens more often than you would think if you pass out when somebody talks about broken bones. Because people talk about it a lot. Particularly, somebody says, a kid comes and says, like, oh, I haven't seen you in 6 weeks. I fell off my skateboard and broke my arm. Right? Look at the scar. And in the old days, my worry, which is not Edith Ethel, there's another one, would be like, shut her up, right? No. And I have to, what I say now is I say, oh my gosh, tell me about it. What happened? Because and my amygdala has learned over a period of time that broken bones are not dangerous when somebody's telling me about a broken bone. So it's all this experiential retraining that you do with love and support, right? We're going to step in, and if you are helping a kid step into something that they've been really worried and anxious about, they have to understand the rationale why I'm doing it.
I think you have to, coping skills use the coping skills to cool your amygdala down so your brain can think about it differently as well.
A little bit. So when you say coping skills, right, so that you have to be careful, because coping skills go very quickly into elimination strategies, right? So do I teach kids breathing? Sometimes, not as often as you would think, because that's a way for them to get their nervous system back under them. But a lot of people spend an enormous amount of time talking about coping skills. And they say coping skills, and I say, well, what are your coping skills? And they say breathing and distraction. And that's all I got. And there's a whole other thing. Coping skills my big coping skill is, we're gonna, if you need to take some breaths so that you get your feet under you, right? That's it. That's good. That's really, really helpful. I had to use that when I was passing out. I needed to make sure I didn't pass out so that I could stay conscious to talk about the broken arm. I've only passed out 3 times in the last 23 years, but prior to that, it was not so great. But the coping skill, I really just talk about umbrella strategies rather than coping skill, because coping skills become these techniques to try and manage the feelings and get rid of the feelings. I'm going to breathe to get rid of the feelings. I'm going to distract to get rid of the feelings or the thoughts. I talk about an umbrella strategy, and it's going to be, I'm going to say, here we go, let's go, all right, on purpose, let's go, come on, Lori, let's go. We're gonna figure out, how can you practice stepping in and responding differently? That's really the main strategy that I teach. Yeah, but kids learn a lot of coping strategies that are, how do I get rid of these feelings? I'm gonna color, I'm gonna use my stress ball, I'm gonna play loud music, I'm going to do breathing, I'm gonna just write, right? That's not learning what I want you to learn. Yeah. Yeah.
So once or twice, we've had to deal with families, or in my career, I've had to deal with families where, you know, a student comes in with a generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis, and they want all the accommodations, taking you back to that, but we find that the child is not working on any skills outside, and the parents aren't working on any skills, but they just want us to give all this layers, and then you can't meet those expectations in any way, and it's just a fait accompli. And it's like, because the parent has the anxiety, and they might be transferring it onto the student then has the anxiety, and the school's the enemy.
Yeah, the school becomes the enemy very quickly, and to make matters worse, there are a lot of outside providers that will support the accommodating also. So, you know, and I am not blaming pediatricians and families, I mean, they're just trying to do what they need to do, but it's not their expertise. So they'll very quickly write a letter that says they don't have to eat in the cafeteria, or they get extended time, or they can, right? So that happens very quickly. So you guys are sort of like, well, we're trying to teach skills here, and the forces are working against you. That happens a lot. And that's what when I'm working with schools, I am talking to schools a lot about how do we educate parents so that they recognize that they are actually, with the best of intentions, doing the thing that is making the problem worse. And it is absolutely paddling upstream, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, there was a kid, he had 18 accommodations. And the family was demanding that he have 18 accommodations, and the dad was an attorney and was calling the superintendent all the time, threatening to sue. And the superintendent was like, my teachers can't do 18 accommodations for one kid. But they just kept getting added and added and added. So it is a big paradigm shift for sure. Yeah. It was interesting, I was in New York, the school district that I've done a lot of work with, and in New York, they have parent education, or parent, I forget the term that they used, can be written into the IEP, particularly for kids, starting with kids on the spectrum. So they're thinking about it. I was talking about this with them a few weeks ago, of how would they write that in, that there need to be parent education about anxiety for any kid that's got an IEP or is seeking accommodations for an anxiety disorder. In New York, they can do it. I don't know what the rules are. You can?
It's federal.
Yeah.
When you're writing it, it's just such a new way of thinking that the accommodation or the goal is not for the child.
Right.
We've been trained.
Yes,
right,
yes,
yeah. But it could be for the family, it can be for the parent, that you can actually write an accommodation.
Oh, so that's federal. They were telling me that was, maybe they just do it in New York more than they do it in other states. Yeah. Because I've had a lot of schools say, like, they have this fantasy that what they want is that for every kid who's, you know, got an IEP or accommodations for anxiety, that they're mandated to come and listen to me talk to them for 2 hours. Yeah. And so New York was saying, like, in New York, they were saying, like, yeah, we could do that. A lot of schools are like, no, our lawyer would say that you can't mandate that. And they were saying, like, no, we can write it into the goal. Which would be a cool thing, isn't it? Because the thing, the approach that I take, or the way that I remind myself all the time, is that if parents knew how to do this, they would do it. No parent is like, you know what, my goal is to have a kid and see how anxious I can make it. Right? They don't say that. I mean, it's not hard, but they don't go, that's not their goal. And so when parents have been given a lot of information, kids have been given a lot of information about this, that makes sense in the short term. It eliminates that immediate distress. They just don't know. I mean, I just always remind myself, you know, they don't know. If they know, they'll figure it out. But it's hard. But boy, does it get acrimonious fast. I've seen that happen. Within like 32 seconds, I've been in meetings where it's like, woo, yeah, I get it. Yeah. But boy, it is paddling upstream. But that's good to know. Yeah,
Hi.
hi.
I am a mom of 3 very young kids. And my question for you is about families where one child struggles with anxiety in certain situations more than the other or others.
Yeah.
And how you would suggest talking to your kids, and especially the one who's struggling, about that without them feeling like there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, well, so you can talk to all of your kids about the fact that we all have a worry part. And some people's worry part shows up and is very, very bossy. And other people's worry part is a little more quiet. And that people have different personalities. Do you have a dog?
No.
Okay, so I talk to kids about, I talk to them about temperament. And I say people have different temperaments. Just like if you have a Chihuahua has a different temperament than a bulldog, right? A golden retriever has a different temperament than my parents' poodle, who we all say she's just kind of a jerk. Not to my parents, they love her, but she's just kind of a jerk. So you can talk to them about how worry shows up for everybody. If you've got a kid where there's worry that's more powerful, it's okay to say to them, you have more powerful worry. You do, and that's okay, because we all have worry, but your worry is pretty powerful. So we're going to start working on making sure that your worry doesn't boss you around, because that's the last thing I want, is for your worry to be in charge of you, or to be in charge of our family, right? So you just really normalize it. Yeah, and the thing with if you've got one kid that's very worried, the other siblings sort of know that, and if you start accommodating that worry, they start getting resentful. They start getting pissed off over time. Because worry in a family is incredibly bossy. I mean, I've had families where they've only been allowed, per the worry, only allowed to go to one restaurant. They've only eaten one restaurant for 10 years. I've got kids that they tell everybody where they're allowed to sit in the car. I mean, the whole family sort of revolves around the worry. It happens with parents, too. There's a worried parent, and the whole family knows how to not trigger the worry. So you just want to talk about it really pretty openly. And the more that we talk about it, you just say like, yeah, you have a worry part, I have a worry part, and then it just gets normalized and it's not a big deal. Yeah, yeah. And if they say, there's something wrong with me, but sometimes with kids, not with little tiny kids, but as they get older, that's a way to get parents to back off too. Stop saying there's something wrong with me. You don't love me. And then right away, they know what to say to sort of, you're trying to say, look, we're not going to accommodate the worry, this is what we're going to work on, this is what we're going to practice, and they know what to say to get you off track, right? They can make a certain threat, they can say a certain thing, and whew, they derail you quickly. Yeah, but just normalize it. Yeah, and the fact that your 3 kids are little and you're thinking about it is awesome, because you're already ahead of the game. Yeah. Anybody got anything else? 8 o'clock. All right. I so appreciate you guys coming out, and I don't know how many people are watching, but hello. I forgot to acknowledge you at the beginning. Thank you for joining on the live stream. There's tons of resources on my website. If there's some question, something that I said that you're just sort of like, oh, I need to explain that more, there's my email right there. I'm happy to, I can't do a clinical consult in an email, but if there's something you need or you're looking for a resource or something, just shoot me an email. The podcast, we've done episodes on tons of stuff. So there's probably, if you're thinking about, if it's sleep that you're talking about, or picky eater, or this or that, there might be an episode that covers it in detail as well.